then where is your fight? I still see too many people in our circle who condemn resistance. 2 years into a Holocaust at this point, not a genocide, a Holocaust. They're burning people alive. If you tolerate this, it will happen to our children. That will happen here. And this is the moment for everyone to act.
Welcome back to the first episode of a brand new season of The Tea, the show where we dive into the stories behind the stories. I'm your host, Myriam Francois. Before we get into this episode, I just want to take a tiny moment to ask you to do one thing for me, and that is to hit that subscribe button now. We're a small independent team, no big networks here, no corporate backing, just a handful of people who care deeply about having honest conversations and shining a light on what often goes unseen or unheard. So if our work does resonate with you too, then subscribe now on YouTube and join us on Patreon, link in our bio. Today, I'm joined by Ashish Prashar, a political strategist and former advisor to Tony Blair, who's worked on political campaigns for the likes of former US Presidents Barack Obama and Joe Biden. But after years working from within the system, Ashish has taken the bold move to work outside of it, shifting his focus towards human rights and Palestinian liberation. He's now part of a new legal effort to hold the former US President Joe Biden, a man he once campaigned for, as well as members of his cabinet, accountable for their role in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Ashish, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, you once campaigned for a man who is probably not the most popular president to go down in history, former US President Joe Biden. Can you tell me what it was about his vision, his platform that initially drew you in?
Honestly, as someone who'd worked for the Democrats in the United States, 2020 seemed like a different time to now. We had Trump in office at that time. He was mishandling COVID. It was a disaster. Biden's team, who, I know a guy who ended up being his chief of staff, was reaching out to people who've worked formerly in senior Democrat roles, and was looking for people to get on the team because Biden promised he'd be the guy who got rid of Trump, and would be in for one, and would only serve one term. And we all know he ended up serving only one term, but as you know, he tried to run again because the arrogance of office does that to people. But at the time, the world was on fire again. It was weirdly on fire. We were in a pandemic, by the way, still ongoing in some way. But also, we had BLM, we had people marching the streets. We had a really revolutionary environment in the United States. And Biden weirdly campaigned also on reforming that very fascist police force that was being used and deployed in the way it is today, but it was at the time killing black kids, still is, by the way, on the streets of America. And he was the Democrat pick at the time in what seemed like a fixed primary, for lack of a better term at the point. But he seemed like an alternative to what could have been doom with Trump at that point, right? Because the pandemic added that layer of uncertainty that, will he even give us vaccines?
Well, and so we're talking about an era where it still felt like there was a choice right, between the candidates. And so I'm very interested to hear from you about the perception among many people today that actually it wasn't possible, for example, to continue voting for the Democrats given the position they'd taken on Gaza. And that whilst there would have been an era not that long ago where most people would have said, well, just to keep Trump out, we will vote Biden regardless of anything, that there's something about where we're at now that things have changed, right? That maybe the illusion of choice within our political systems has started to erode to the extent that I'm not sure that whether it's a real or an illusionary sense of choice has been maintained for many members of the public, whether in the US or in the UK. So I'm just, did that factor into your
so foreign
shift?
Policy, someone who's a Brit, also knowing American foreign policy and working on foreign policy, American foreign policy has never really changed it from president to president. But domestically, selfishly, we were like fighting what we thought was the leader who was going to take, just effectively destroy the country, right? That's how it was being pitched, right? Someone who had no morals, someone who was going to take our rights away and everything else,
go against the Constitution.
Who said he would be a permanent president.
Massive tariffs that are likely to tank your economy.
All the things he's doing today, right? But also, the problem with all of that was the Democrats won the election. Biden won the election. By the way, the people won that election. To your point, I think you mentioned people didn't want to vote for Joe Biden. So a lot of us wanted any Democrat president to beat him at that point, right? So we wanted someone to stop his crazy, stop his oppression. You already saw elements of it really early with the BLM stuff where he was like walking to a church and asked his troops to fire gas canisters directly in the crowds that were protesting. You know, you saw elements of how far it could go.
Yeah.
And Biden just was the alternative. The American public won that. The black activists won that election. The indigenous activists won that election because they had to get Trump out.
Yeah.
Because at that point, the alternative, the Trump term being the second term, seemed like doom. I'd say the biggest mistake, and I want to just point this out, is kind of wish he won. And the reason I wish he won is he could have accelerated almost this imperial downfall of the United States, but also domestically. There hasn't been a more revolutionary moment in the United States than 2020. And that
2020?
Yeah, because white mums were on the front lines of those BLM marches. White people were putting their bodies on the line. White people were being shot at by the police to protect their black neighbors at that point. The police were on the back foot. The institutions were on their back foot. And the reality is, the reason they wanted us back at work is to stop caring about each other. What Biden's win allowed to happen was take the wind out of real revolution.
It neutered the revolutionary impetus that many people were observing.
Yes.
And that many people who are critical of the current political makeup of our societies would say is what consistently happens to any movement that seeks radical change
100%.
in the face of a system that's systemically broken, right? And that is to afford these kind of piecemeal concessions that allow people to feel like some level of victory was achieved, but actually what progress was actually undertaken.
And a black activist told me he allowed white people to tap out.
He allowed white people to tap out.
So we elected the good guy.
Yeah.
We did our job. Take it from here.
So what was your turning point with Biden? Because obviously you're there, you're campaigning for this person. You obviously believe that he can offer an alternative that's necessary. You're obviously very politically invested, but there's a turning point for you.
Right. So for me, I am also impacted by the justice system here in the United Kingdom. I was incarcerated as a kid here. I believe in abolition. It's been in my DNA for a long time.
Yeah.
Even trying to work in with the system, I've tried to change things. Ironically, you're going to laugh. The biggest justice reform bill passed in the United States was by Donald Trump, of all people, not a Democrat. In fact, Bill Clinton and Biden and Obama have locked up more black and brown kids than even their Republican counterparts.
Which speaks to the point we were just making a second ago, right? Which is these small concessions that ultimately don't actually disrupt the fundamental inequalities.
And Biden went back on all his promises. Like, there's a manifesto which you can still download from their 2020 campaign, because, they don't delete things, I guess. And it made promises of massive reforms on the police, a defunding, frankly, from the federal lens of it, a look at sentencing, getting rid of the death penalty permanently, making sure people who are in weed were all released, enforcing federal laws onto states to do that. All these things that, while not perfect, are a huge step forward in freeing people who should not be incarcerated, in changing the power of the police force. And it was very telling within 3 months that was not going to happen.
Yes.
Like, he dismantled all those promises. He actually increased funding for the police in his first 6 months.
So can I just roll back a second here, Ashish? Because this wasn't your first foray into official politics, right? You'd worked for Tony Blair prior to that. You'd worked for Boris Johnson's campaign here in London, the former mayor of London, and also former prime minister. Surely this can't have been your first delusion, shattering of your illusions about the promises politicians make and what they actually undertake. But something was different this time because you've not stayed within the formal political processes. So what was different this time?
I mean, when I stepped out of the other roles, they were for real moral reasons. And going back to different people in those worlds was for a specific reason. For example, like in 2008, I resigned from the Conservatives because, I wrote a whole piece in the New Statesman, which you can still get today, saying, hey, these guys are racist and prejudiced. And if you elect them in 2010, you're doomed. And we've seen what that led to. And Blair, the reality was, when offered an opportunity to work on the Middle East peace process, part of me thought, and this is something that even maybe people like George Galloway, who I've had conversations with about this, have told. Part of me thought he negotiated Good Friday with Clinton and everyone else.
Yes. So for
part of
those
me
who aren't
thought-
familiar with the
yeah.
Good Friday Agreement, it's, the seminal peace agreement between the Irish resistance in the form of, politically represented by Sinn Féin, but militarily represented by the IRA, and the British who continued to occupy Northern Ireland.
And part of me thought that he wanted to undo the Iraq legacy. Like, we all know how politicians care about their legacy, or how people are going to remember them, what is going to be said about them in 50 years. They are like narcissists to their core.
Sure.
And part of me thought taking advantage of that narcissism is that maybe he wants to actually create a settlement that would be good for everyone.
Yes.
Where he could undo what Iraq did.
So you had hopes that you could play to this man's egos in a way to advance, peace in the region.
Yes.
Which, to be fair, you wouldn't, I'm sure, be the first person to hope
100%.
you could lean into that. And I know I've heard this said about people close to Trump, that there are efforts to, figure out what buttons his ego enjoys
100%.
being
And look,
pushed.
I was in, a lot younger. And at that time, I was there's something here. He also wanted to openly talk to Hamas.
Yes.
It's also not a secret. He's written about it in The Guardian, how we should talk to terrorists, how quote unquote, what we perceive as terrorists.
So you go into this Middle East peace process with Tony Blair. Obviously, backdrop of this is the Iraq War, which was obviously a complete disaster. We were lied to. Millions of Iraqis lost their lives. Iraq continues to be in disarray till this day, reeling from the consequences of that illegal invasion. But you're thinking to yourself, there may be an opportunity here. So you go into this opportunity, and what do you sort of unravel?
For me, it was being in the West Bank. For me, it was a lot of the work's done remotely. London, New York, wherever we're meeting people of influence in this. And a couple of incidents happened in the West Bank, and I was like, okay, this is not ever going to be solved by any of our institutions.
Give me one of the starkest of those
One
moments.
of them was our Israeli escort telling us that this road was sanitized. And we haven't heard language like that since Nazis, right? So, and frankly, apartheid South Africa, meaning that when we were being driven down this road, telling us that it's been sanitized because Palestinians can't come on it, and showing us examples of it, right? So you have a street where there's Israeli houses, and they can come out on the street, and there are Palestinian houses on the street, but their doors have been welded shut. So they can't literally come out on that street. They have to find another way out of their own home to somewhere else.
Yes.
Sanitized.
Right.
Think about that, the language.
And what was the reaction of the team around you?
Most people kept their mouths quiet, and I was a bit shocked that anyone would do that. And also someone who's experienced, as a young age, like I know what that is, oppression, like being in a prison in the United Kingdom.
Yes.
At 17. So I know that.
So let's roll back for people who don't know your personal story then, just briefly. So you're incarcerated at 17. Tell us just briefly a little bit about that story.
Yeah, I was incarcerated for theft. I was a stupid kid who was in a group of friends who stole some stuff from Harvey Nichols.
Yes.
Yeah, and, being brown, we weren't given a slap on the wrist. We were actually sentenced to a year in prison in Feltham, which is, for the Americans watching, like Rikers, which is a really violent thing. And anyone watching in the UK knows that it's where kids get hung.
It's a tough prison.
It's a really tough prison.
Yeah. And this was your first offence.
First offence.
And it was your only offence.
Only offence.
And you took a year.
We were sentenced to a year, and I was out luckily within 4 months because, and this is where the funny thing about symmetry in life is that because my grandparents and my family fought to get me out because they thought the sentence was egregious, my grandparents and my aunt wrote to Jack Straw, who ended up, and
former Home Secretary
former
Jack
Home
Straw,
Secretary, to have me released early and also let me take my A-levels in prison, which was at that time not normal. They only got up to GCSEs at Feltham the year 2000, 2001, and I was allowed to do that.
Meaning for people who aren't aware, that means that students at this prison could not pursue their education past the age of 14.
16, past effectively
GCSEs is 16
and then A-levels 18.
18, so 16 they'd be cut off. They wouldn't be able to pursue education.
No education. And I think that's changed since, but back then that was an anomaly.
But that was still in place until 2000.
And, my grandparents changed my life, right? So they got me out early. They raised me. I owe them the world, and but I never forgot that feeling.
Yes.
Right. I was assaulted. I've been held up by guards on a wall and attacked, and like waiting for. And they're looking for a response, right? Because they know if you respond, it's like what Palestinians go through every day. Like if you respond, you get more time. Right. So you have to like keep your calm, keep cool, and all that stuff. And I know what that environment's like. And the second incident in Palestine was exactly that. So we were at a checkpoint, and I literally watched a Israeli occupation soldier take his gun and back the head of a child, a 14-year-old, and beat him in front of diplomats. And no one did nothing. No one said nothing. And even some of us who filed a report, that report didn't go anywhere.
Right.
No one at the UN, which owns the envoy's office, did anything about it.
Yes.
It's probably one of multiple reports that I'm sure have been filed over decades about their abuses. And that's why I resigned. I was like, that's it. We're not going to do it.
So you returned from this trip to the occupied West Bank.
Yep.
And you resign from your position as a Middle East advisor.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, what would you say that you learned about the system working within it that continues to inform how you operate today?
The system can be tweaked, but it can't be changed. It needs to be blown up and start again, for lack of a better term, because the reality is that, especially in foreign policy, the West has got its Western policy, and it's like extractionist. It's I think this is the reason people hate Trump. The reason Western leaders hate Trump is he's open in his prejudice and racism and direct of, this is what we want. And it removes all masks. When he says we want resources, he's talking about them. He's talking about the UK, France. Yeah. He's talking about when they go and back something, what are we going to get out of it? That's literally how all of them think.
Of course.
The reason they're frightened of Trump is he just tells the rest of the world what all Western leaders and politicians and institutions think. And what I learned in the Middle East was that we are going to hold up the Israeli regime and hopefully slowly disappear the Palestinians. So, in my couple of years of work there, that was very true. The projects we worked to develop Palestinians, the economy and everything was small. The Israeli investment was huge. You could see that. The piece, anytime we had conversations with the PA and the Israeli leadership, you knew what statements were going to be published and whatever. And you could see it happening in real time. And, I knew resigning would be the end of any future foreign office or diplomatic career, but it was the right thing to do. And if you've experienced any form of repression, it shouldn't take you that, but if you've experienced it firsthand, it would be immoral to sit there and carry on this charade.
So how did you make sense of what you were observing, which is these regular, and I'd say until recently, because as you say, I think with Trump, there is a sort of unwillingness to even kind of play to the charade of, no, of course we respect human rights and international law and blah, blah. Trump's just like, we've never cared about it. And it's sort of, I think that's where a lot of us are struggling with this cognitive dissonance, which is like, we always knew that, America had a complete disregard for international law, but at least on the face of it, they were pretending to want to uphold it, pretending that they had to pay lip service. And when that disappears, I think it leaves many of us completely disorientated as to, what is it, this new kind of era that we're moving into? And of course, we can come back to that because some of what we're moving into is plain and visible in 100%. Terms of the decisions that Trump is making. But I just want to ask you before that about something you said there, which was, you observed that, there was this charade of like, we're going to discuss peace or, to try and figure out peace. But then in reality, a profound imbalance in the interactions between the two. How did you make sense of that in the context? So you're going there on what is perceived to be a peace mission, but then on the ground, you witnessed something very different.
Yeah.
What were you actually doing? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
You were sent purportedly there about peace, but from what you're saying, that wasn't. So what were you there for?
I think we're always sent for a PR opportunity, right? So I think...
But beyond that, who cares about PR that shows, the Americans or the British being engaged in a peace process?
The Americans and British care about that PR. The Israelis care about that PR.
Okay, but why? Why do they care?
Because they want to show that the people who are not willing for peace are the Palestinians, especially the Israelis. They want to show that they're the ones who don't want peace. They're the ones, they often bring up that how Palestinians have had like 13 opportunities or whatever opportunities to sign a peace thing. Well, Can I ask British people or Americans, if someone walked in, stole your land, and then said to you, you'll have 20% of that land or whatever it is, would you agree to those terms? No, I don't think anyone would agree to those terms.
Right.
There is every right for those Palestinians to walk away from those agreements, but they would use these negotiations, they would use opportunities or envoys' offices set up to discuss future terms, future potential states or a settlement between the two to say that Israel's all aboard on this train. The Americans are doing everything they can. The British are doing everything they can to be peacemakers and power brokers in the world. It's soft power too, right? It's our brand to the world. We care about how about how we are perceived to the world.
Yes.
We did try to do this more recently with Ukraine, right? We were like going to save Ukrainians. We mobilized actually the world on a lie, frankly, about this. So we mobilized literally the whole world. Countries that would never get involved in this sanctioned Russia. People in the global south did. They turned their backs on them and expelled their ambassador. We do this all because we do care about how we're perceived. We do care about the American story. We care about the British story. And we're seen as the good guys. The mask fall off.
So we did care, you said.
With the Israeli occupation's recent genocide and continued genocide, I still think the West did pretend to care, like at least. Antony Blinken and Joe Biden famously saying we're trying to negotiate a ceasefire every week because they know the majority of the public still watch CNN. And they know the majority of the public still take their news from the BBC. The majority of the public will still believe their line on this, that they're fighting for this, and the reluctant side is the other side. You often see this in who's bringing down ceasefires. They always say, well, Hamas fired the first shot of this thing. Well, no, that's never found to be true in the end. And by the time it's untrue, it's too late. But they do care about their brand to their own people and how they're perceived to the rest of the world to a degree. The mask slips off, frankly, during this with Biden because the lies were just too hard to hide. Israel and America and Britain have always relied on is complete control of mainstream media to get their message out. Our mobile phones changed that. TikTok changed it. Instagram changed it. Facebook, whatever platform people started to see images on have changed it. People saw what happened on October 7th. It's changed it. Yeah. They saw that the stuff that people like Piers Morgan were saying on TV wasn't true. They were seeing for their own eyes that we've been sold a lie, and they couldn't counteract that. And the reason people go, Israel and America with all their money couldn't handle the effectively other side story is because they're so used to complete control. They didn't realize that the young in our countries were going to watch dead bodies on TikTok. Yeah. They didn't realize that Instagram was going to show people that Israel commit war crimes and that the Israelis themselves were posting these war crimes. And they had no sense of control. So at the beginning, they thought they were winning this message because, and they were still seen as the good guys because they didn't realize where people were consuming this. And it was almost too late at that point. And then the mask dropped because it became too late. And they were just like, well, whatever. The American administration, Blinken didn't even hide it. Blinken was like, yes, we knew starvation was happening in March 2024. But there's a report. He said he didn't care. He even said a group of Palestinian leaders in the United States met with Antony Blinken. And he said, if we have to care for Palestinians, we will starve the world.
So here's the thing. So we see a shift from the 2000 era to now where clearly the current US administration and its lackeys, and I say that in the sense that we're speaking here today from London, where there's still this perception that America is our great ally. I think that there's if they haven't observed the slaps they've been taking, I don't know how many more slap downs they need to recognize that no ally of ours would treat us specifically when it comes to things like trade agreements, which is kind of a very simple level at which to negotiate, surely with our oldest ally, is reflective of a different era that we're in right now. American isolationism is in full force, and they don't give a flying about us here in England or in Britain or in Europe. And the quicker we wake up to that, I think, the better. But obviously, there's still this perception that, America is, just slightly off tilt, but is going to kind of recalibrate. And so I just want to ask you about that in view of what we've been seeing in this shift. So we're now seeing, Trump's actions since he's come to power, dismantling the Department of Education, challenging constitutional rights, deportations, the tariffs. It feels like the facade of American democracy itself is unraveling.
Yeah.
And with that, of course, much of the charade around the legitimacy of the international order, which is upheld in many ways by America and the West and their purported commitment to that international framework. Now they no longer seek to uphold it. You know, the defunding of UNRWA and in general, even strikes on UN staff in Palestine suggests that there's an unwillingness to even pay lip service to that old order. So what is your reading of this? You know, I know some people talk about this as sort of indicative of the fall of empire. And of course, you know, theorists have written about the rise and fall of empires throughout history. Even Khaldun, right, has civilizational theories about kind of, you know, for every great civilization that rises, it always comes down. What goes up must come down. Are we in the must come down curve of American decline? Or do we think this is as I think many people are hoping, a momentary deviation or blip?
It's not a momentary deviation. This is America and being honest about this is America being honest about America. Like, it's actually always been this way. The reality is that it's been masked really well through some of those PR things that they're very good at, whether it's international order or mobilizing people around something. They've masked it pretty well. Trump's just I go back to it. I think his like honesty is a blessing for the rest of the world. His open honesty about what they do and what they want is open. As you go back to something earlier, 2018, he did a famous Super Bowl interview. And a president always does one on Super Bowl day because the whole country watches it, right? So it's a great opportunity for the president to say what they want to say. He famously was questioned about Putin back then and like how he's barbaric. And Trump said openly, like, we're not the good guys. We go around killing people in the world. So what?
Yes.
And people don't take that stuff seriously. That's, you know, it's like, ha ha, you know, he's just being funny. But he's not. He's honest about who America is. And and look, we've had a Biden term in the middle and an Obama term before. Obama famously bombed a Yemeni wedding. And we're talking about Trump's strikes in Yemen. But like, he killed tons of civilians. The biggest drone program in escalation was under Obama. He killed more people then than even Biden or Trump since with the drone program. So presidents have continued this path. Going back to the European aspect of this, what more do you need to see? Like, what European leaders, you've been taken for fools. And you are, maybe you are fools. You're letting your publics down because he didn't lie about what he wanted to do with Ukraine. And also, by the way, Biden signed the first business deal with Ukraine. This is American foreign policy. What can we get out of it?
Yes.
Right? You got American companies lined up for mineral rights deals with Ukraine for American funding of arms to continue. Joe Biden organized that. Antony Blinken organized that. Not Donald Trump. Donald Trump's escalating it. And the reason there isn't a peace deal right now is they're negotiating directly with Putin about who gets what out of Ukraine. In Europe, you can keep pretending you're going to send troops because no one believes you, because no European citizen is going to go fight for Ukrainians.
Correct.
No one's going to go pick up guns against the Russian army. No one's going to do that. So European, with their posturing, with their press conferences where they put their suits on and whatever the hell they're doing, right? It's just posturing. And are we going to continue to send money to a war that, by the way, is over by any stretch of the imagination? The Americans and Russians will settle this. Ukraine will sign this. And the reality is, like most people in America have backed, that if they've decided to turn their back on, we've seen this in history from Chile to like Vietnam and everything else, those leaders end up disappearing. And I'm sorry, Zelensky will probably go away somewhere, maybe to Switzerland, maybe something else. Who knows?
Who knows? Like here, Epstein's Island's free.
But the reality is that Europe has no say in how that sells. Now, when he talks about other things, Europe will not have us. Did Starmer, Macron know that they were going to call Hamas up and talk to them directly, and suddenly go on CNN and said they were not that bad to talk to directly? They're like just like us.
So let's talk about that briefly, because my understanding is that even senior members of the U.S. administration were unaware that those backdoor negotiations with Hamas were going to happen. And when it was leaked, that's when we suddenly got the if you remember the Mahmoud Khalil posters, deport him now, and all kinds of other, shock and awe tactics designed to kind of reinforce and I think probably reassure the Israelis
100%.
that these backdoor negotiations weren't sort of a betrayal, which is obviously 100%. How they were being painted internally.
But I go back to the foreign policy elements. Europe, you're not in the room.
Yes.
They will eventually get a deal with Hamas.
Okay.
I believe
you
that.
think there'll be a direct deal between the US and America?
Yes, and it will involve Qatar probably and everything. But I don't see Starmer in the room. I don't see Macron in the room. They might even have a deal where these guys get to go. Like, that works maybe. I don't believe they're any friend to Palestinians. Let's just get that true. Let's get that out there. But there might be a deal that gives them some power. How are European leaders going to feel about that when they keep saying they can't be in power ever again? Like, it doesn't matter what you think, actually.
Yes.
They're talking to Iran. They're about to start to talk to Iran, and they might have direct talks immediately. They might skip the whole channel of indirect talks.
Yeah.
Europe didn't know about that. Again, Macron's not in the room. Starmer's not in the room. They might have a nuclear deal without Europe.
Yeah.
Europe doesn't have a say, is irrelevant in this discussion. And on a more micro level, European leaders are still so desperate to have a good relationship with them without being multipolar and connecting with other organizations or countries in the world.
Emerging powers.
That even the British government is abandoning British citizens who've been arrested by ICE so they can get a better trade tariff. Peter Mandelson's embassy in Washington, D.C. has let Brits get arrested. And instead of fighting for them like other countries have been fighting for their citizens who've been arrested, Colombia asking for a fair deportation, they sent the jet so they could get their people not in handcuffs. They're fighting for their people. Brits have been in prison cells, in ICE detention cells, which anyone knows anything about this, these are basically torture cells. People have been forced to hose shower. A British citizen recently wrote about her experience, and she's a white woman from the north. They're not just arresting brown and black people. So if you're a Brit going to America this summer, and this will be continuing, by the way, if you are arrested by ICE, don't expect Peter Mandelson to come for you. Don't expect Keir Starmer to come for you, because they're desperately trying to cling on some special relationship that does not exist. Because if it did, British people would be treated a bit better in the United States. And that's part of the problem. We're holding on to something that existed a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like we've always been the junior partner in that.
Yes.
But now is non-existent, and we're still clamoring onto something that has no purpose for us.
I mean, definitely as someone who lives in Britain, it feels to me like Britain is still holding on to a perception of itself as having a much greater relevance on the world stage than I think is reflected by the reality of what we're observing. That today, the UK, especially separate from Europe, is a small backwater with, a dwindling economy and a huge brain drain.
100%.
This country is in free fall at the moment. And there's no real recognition of that, because there's just this desperation that somehow if we continue to cling on to American coattails, that we will recover.
Yeah.
And I don't think that there are any promises, at least from what we're seeing from the Trump administration, that there are any overtures being made that suggest that we will be included in whatever end game we're meant to see here. And the only end game I'm currently seeing is the US economy tanking hard, right? So I don't know what this is who we're expecting to follow
but
down.
Also just on that point,
lane.
Everything he's doing is deliberate by design. People think it's like he doesn't know what he's doing. Still, we're in this mindset of Trump doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah.
Everything, the people around, it's by design.
Yeah.
Bannon's whole plan when they took office is shock and awe. Yes. The executive orders are by design distracting media. Oh, he's doing this, he's doing that.
Right.
But under the surface, they know what they're doing, right? They're like every fascist regime, they're going after the public, the courts, the politicians.
Education.
And then the government departments, right? So guess what? Politicians folded. Democrats, Hakeem Jeffrey, the leader of the Democrat Party, basically said, we can't do anything. Mitch McConnell, who is the devil, was the Republican leader under Obama, had no Senate, no House, and still said openly on day one, I want to make him a one-term president. And while he had no real say in anything, he just got in the way.
Right.
Hakeem Jeffries isn't even attempting to get in the way. The poster child to the left, AOC, is doing nothing about it. And I just want to say that this is the important part. The courts are half theirs.
Yes.
And also they've already shown that they're not going to listen to rulings against them.
Yes.
Because guess what? The courts don't have any enforcement power because the executive controls enforcement.
Well, and they've made that very clear.
Very clear. And then the third thing is the government departments. after Trump's first term, they were hollowed out a bit. And the government departments, actually, people don't know, a lot of people in the government fought back on his changes. And a lot of those civil servants are not there anymore. And Biden didn't refill the civil service in his 4 years. Obviously, the pandemic impacted the first 2 of those.
Yeah.
So, like, he didn't, like, refill the shop.
Yes.
So hollowing out the civil service and getting rid of government departments has never been easier in the United States. And finally, he's leaving it to the public.
Yeah.
And the one thing he knows, and this touches on your green card thing with Mahmoud Khalil, they want Khalil to go to court.
Yes.
And the reason this is so important to them is because it sets up a fight on citizenship. And I'll tell everyone why quickly. American governments, like any government, can take away visas. Like, you know,
Yes.
any government has the right to take away visas, for whatever reasons. The green card to people is like, you're basically an American citizen.
Well,
It's
that's
like,
what I always
it's golden.
thought.
You've got that,
Yeah.
you're on your way. Like, you're okay. The only thing you can't do is vote and get Social Security, right? So it's super protected. You need a court order to remove it.
Yeah.
So the reason they're going after this so hard, and a Palestinian, yes, it is to maybe reinforce their loyalty to Israel, their relationship with Israel, but actually it's really tactical because they believe the left and the center left will not back him. Like if this was a Latino guy or
Yes.
a black guy from Jamaica who's getting screen cover, maybe AOC and
Might
Hakeem
speak
Jeffries
up.
will speak up and it will turn into a political football until the court date. But have you noticed that no Democrat leader, including the poster child of the left, is saying anything in defense of Mahmoud Khalil? And they're using everyone's myopic prejudice,
Yes.
not wanting to speak about Palestine, as the way to make this happen and get a ruling in their favor. And the reason they're doing this is they want to use the national security argument to go after citizenship. And the first step after the green card, if they get the ruling they want, is naturalized citizens. So if you're an American who emigrated there and became a citizen, that's not protected under the Constitution. Birthright is. They will use the same ruling to go after the 30 million Americans who are naturalized. That is going to set precedent to hollow the country out for the people they want to stay in the country.
Got it.
And they can use national security because you don't have to delve what the national security incident is publicly every time. And
Because
the
of
reason
terrorism
you know where they
laws.
got this idea from? The UK. Because of the Begum case.
So Shamima Begum, a young girl who was a teenager, was basically trafficked by, for all intents and purposes, Canadian Secret Services into ISIS-held territory at the time. And she ends up becoming a teen mom, loses all her children, is then detained in a camp. And despite being a dual national, British Bengali, she'd never been to Bangladesh. And the British government strips her of her British identity. The Bengali government says, well, we're not going to take her because she's never been here and she's not Bengali. And so she basically ends up stateless in still today in northeastern Syria in a camp that's controlled by
And you
Kurdish
can thank
authorities,
the British government's like lack of morals for this charade that you're seeing in the United States, not charade, but like policy that you're seeing in the United States.
Yeah.
And the eventual goal is to go after birthright. Not enough people are talking about this.
Yeah.
And the reason that not enough people are talking about it, they're prejudiced against Palestinians. They
Yeah.
can't see the path from this green card to birthright.
Yeah.
Marco Rubio has already set out that naturalized citizens aren't protected.
He's already stated that.
saying the State Department can you apply this to naturalized citizens? They were like, we're not going to deny that. Like they've literally gone and done it. They're not even hiding what I'm telling you.
They're not even hiding where we're heading.
So,
This is
and we're still seeing the left and the center left not want to talk about Palestine.
So this is what Noura Erakat, Professor Noura Erakat talks about as Palestinians being the canaries in the coal mine, right? So Palestinians are being used to set
100%.
legal precedents that impact the wider civil liberties of all citizens, and yet ingrained prejudice, which has been, worked deep into us for years, generations, is impeding our ability to recognize that kind of regardless of who this is happening to, it's an assault on all of our freedoms.
100%.
So just on that point, before I want to hear about the case that you are leading against Biden, but before we get to that, so is there a sense for you that today in America, that what gets called the pro-Palestine movement, I have my reservations about the term because I think that the movement is really about equality, freedom, justice. I don't know if it's like pro-Palestine. It makes it sound like it's a football team and it's really not. But anyway, we'll call it that. So is there a sense today that the sort of pro-Palestine movement has actually merged with an almost existential fight against increasingly over fascists. So that actually today, when people are marching for Palestine, they're actually marching for something much wider than that. I mean, is that your sense today? And can you just explain that?
And there's a difference between that and the marches you saw over the past week and the hands-off marches.
Tell us what the mood's been like.
So Palestinians have always fought for everyone. And themselves will always say, I remember at the beginning of this when, look, this genocide is the issue of our time. You can't fight fascism if you're failing to address the most fascist crime that can be committed. Because anyone not talking about the genocide is not really fighting fascism because it's our foreign policy. So you can't fight that. And not talk about that and then say you're fighting Trump at home or fighting
Hashtag All Lives Matter.
Yeah, hashtag All Lives Matter. It's a very appropriate term. But the Palestinians have always fought for everyone. I remember at the beginning of this when in the United States a Palestinian kid was stabbed in Chicago.
Yeah, 6-year-old boy, I think it was, right?
Palestinians from Gaza who are being shelled, reaching out to that family, right? Not because they're Palestinian, because the kid was stabbed.
Yeah.
Right? I, unfortunately, have had an incident where an Israeli woman attacked my son in a playground.
Right.
Because I wore a keffiyeh.
Yeah.
1 month after the genocide started.
Yeah.
She tried to burn my son with a hot beverage and threw a phone at him.
Unbelievable. In New York.
In New York,
in
in a playground. And Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank reached out to me. Think about that.
Yes.
They're under siege.
Yes.
They're being massacred, yet people from there in Palestine found the time and energy and showed their affection and love. And this has been reported multiple times where people have had incidents in the United States or UK where they've been attacked, where people from Palestine have sent their love.
Yeah.
And yet, I can't get half the country, more than half of it sometimes, to even engage in talking about a genocide that's happening to that same race of people. So all that to say is that, like, we if we're not going to talk about this genocide, we're not fighting fascism.
Right.
And those marches that happened in the United States, while great that like a whole bunch of people turned out this last weekend to say hands off our community, hands off our rights, hands off this. A lot of those people, those marches, were told they can't carry Palestinian signs. And that should speak to what those marches are. My favorite, not so favorite sign was if Kamala won, we'd still be at brunch. That basically is where American liberals are.
Wow.
Right?
I mean, that tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah, so we'll continue the genocide, but we'll be at brunch.
Yeah.
That's kind of where they want to be.
Yes.
The reason Trump annoys them, while he annoys foreign leaders for other reasons, is he holds up America to who Americans are.
Yes.
And a lot of white Americans by that extent, a lot of white liberal Americans, and anyone else who's brought the Kool-Aid into the American capitalist thing. Like, that's who they are. We don't really care about anybody else.
You don't want to see your brunch eggs drenched in Palestinian kids' blood. No. You just want brunch. No. And the blood, can we have that as a side?
Yes, and that's basically where they're at. I mean, the fact that they're still holding up those signs like she was going to be better for them and better for the United States is insane. And to give them context, if they think it's going to be better for them, the reason we're at this point where Marco Rubio and Donald Trump can strip green cards is because Antony Blinken laid the groundwork for that. He was already looking. A lot of Palestinians can speak to this better than me. They were already revoking student visas for Arab and Palestinian citizens who partake in the student encampments in the summer in 2024 because the election hadn't happened until November, so Trump was in office. So a lot of people who couldn't go back to many universities in the United States who were appealing their decisions. And the reason we didn't hear about it is lawyers were advising them not to create a media storm around it so they can maybe get there.
Well, we saw it here too, right? Yeah. There was this Palestinian student here who was stripped of her visa for using the word resistance.
Yes, it's wild.
A protest.
So that was already happening, and Blinken was looking into stripping green cards for Palestinians. So the groundwork was laid for Marco Rubio and Donald Trump to do this by Democrats. So if Democrats think this is going to get better, no chance.
So what I'm hearing from you, which is something that I feel like I'm hearing a lot on social media and from friends, is in general that the idea that we have a system that offers genuine choice between candidates, that offer differential programs and visions for the future, future has been completely eroded.
Yeah.
That actually most of us are now waking up to the reality that these political leaders, while some small variants in terms of domestic policies, overall, it seems that they have been completely co-opted by private interests. And that in that sense, the very notion of us living in a democratic system of, people powered by the people for the people is illusionary, right? Completely illusionary. The Tea is a fully independent, non-partisan production. No corporate ties here, just a small, dedicated team working hard to bring you honest, impactful conversations. If you believe in our work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click on that subscribe button now and join us as a Patreon. You'll find the link in our bio. Can you tell us a little bit, obviously you're now revealing, here on The Tea, an exclusive about a case that you've been working on, right? Which is the case to prosecute former US President Joe Biden and his cabinet. Can you tell us a little bit about that case and why you're bringing that?
Well, the reason we think it's important, and also I want to shout out to Dawn, who've already filed a case with the ICC. And that's really important that we still, while I think a lot of the international bodies are useless at this point, it's really important to just set precedent by making sure the cases against people who think they're untouchable are filed at these bodies to say, hey, we've tried it through this, right? The reason I think this is really important is one of Obama's biggest crimes isn't just the drone program, isn't just failure on lots of other things. One of his biggest crimes was never prosecuting people who organized the Iraq War.
Yes.
He tried to use it as an American merging moment to water under the bridge. We're all going to be friends again.
Yes.
And maybe it was, I would say, maybe it was naivety, or maybe it was deliberate. Maybe he's told he couldn't do it. Whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a crime because allowing these war criminals to continue with their life is how we get to Gaza today. If there's prosecutions against Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, oh, by the way, press secretaries like Nicole Wallace, who've got TV shows on MSNBCs, and people like Tony Blair and maybe Alistair Campbell, who wrote a dossier that lied about. So while he is like a really popular figure post-Brexit in the United Kingdom, let's just be honest, he should be in a prison cell for lying about WODs, like his boss, like my former boss.
But you and I both know that doesn't happen.
Right. But that's one of Obama's biggest crimes because it leads to Gaza. Every inaction on these important things. So whether we fail or not, whether we use every international body or use local courts to do this, and I'll get to the case itself in a second, it's important we do try to do this. Because if we don't do this, there'll be another Holocaust and another Holocaust and another Holocaust. And it's not to say we shouldn't be doing other things to prevent that too, but there needs to be legal accountability or attempted legal accountability everywhere. So while Dawn has filed that in the ICC.
And Dawn, just for those who don't know what that is.
It's a Arab American organization in the United States that represents the Arab American community. It does foreign policy. It's a fantastic legal organization. Raid Jara, who filed the case, is a hero, frankly. This is important because he's risked everything by filing that case, because you can imagine the institutions will crack down on people who've worked on it.
Absolutely. But so here's my question to you, Ashish, because we've just spoken about kind of the ways in which the charade of, democracy, of international framework of law and human rights has really been dismantled over the course of this last 16 months, leaving many of us sort of wondering where it is that we actually are. What makes you believe that you can get accountability or justice from within the very system that surely has been used as part of the cover?
Right. So multiple countries, even in Europe, have spoken out in support of Palestine. Take Ireland, take Spain, Norway, whatever. So we're working on a multi-jurisdictional case using domestic laws, not just international. By the way, all these countries have signed international treaties to say they'd uphold the Rome Statute, and war crimes and genocide are part of those crimes, and they have to do that domestically. But also, a lot of people post 9/11 have a lot of domestic terror laws that include war crimes and genocide and everything else. So we're trying to do a multi-jurisdictional case that would be filed in a European nation specifically, that reaches out to maybe 6 others, that uses both the international laws themselves and laws that we found in those countries that target people who've committed war crimes.
Yes.
Things like starvation, things that which is basically also the ICC has already put out an arrest warrant on the basis of starvation for Benjamin Netanyahu. By the way, Antony Blinken and Joe Biden accept that they had a part to play in that. And frankly, I think Joe Biden's exit interview on TV, he said, yes, we starved Palestinians.
Yeah.
So the evidence is there for everyone. But all that to say is that we were trying to file a multi-jurisdictional case in domestic courts. And the reason is in countries that have been supportive of Palestine as well. This ain't, we're not going to rely on just international institutions. We're going to rely on the public in those countries, the political nous of leaders in those countries that want to be re-elected too and might not get in the way of a case. It's the courts, it's the justice system that's going after you. Hey, Biden, I'm sorry. We don't interfere like you do with your courts.
Yeah.
And we're not just going after Biden. And this is really important. It's Blinken.
Yeah.
It's Austin. But it's also architects of this genocide. It's not making the mistakes that our predecessors made by not going after the press secretaries who created consent. That's like the Karine Jean-Pierre's. That's the Matt Millers of the world.
Yeah.
The people who wrote the policy, who've been advising everyone since Bush, by the way, like Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk. By the way, Brett McGurk recently flew through Europe and has a job at a fancy VC and he's paid millions of dollars to advise.
Well, Netanyahu just flew over French and airspace and a number of other countries.
The reason I mention that, though, is so let's just say the case is heard. At the very least, I don't know we're not going to get arrest warrants immediately, but we might get summonses.
Okay.
And no American is going to be summoned to a European court not knowing the outcome.
Yeah.
And this is the important part. We might not be able to get justice immediately, because even if we get them in a courtroom, it might take years, right? But hey, can we not make their life harder? Can we not make the world smaller? And the same can be said for the work of the Hindu Rajab Foundation for Israeli soldiers.
Yes.
Right? We need to make the world impossible for them to operate in outside the United States or Israel to show the net is tight and we will come for you.
Yeah.
Right? Because again, Trump has done something else. And this is the beautiful thing about having a president who doesn't care about anyone but himself.
Yeah.
And is very open about this. He will not defend them.
What do you mean he won't defend them?
Historically, American state departments might come to the rescue.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Trump is a very vindictive human being and blames Biden.
You think he'd be quite happy to watch
Biden rot in a court like he had to for 3 years?
Yes.
100%.
Yes.
Do I think he's already stripped Antony Blinken's security clearance and Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk's? He's already basically punishing anyone who served for Biden in that. Do you think he's going to come to the rescue of maybe a Karine Jean-Pierre, Haitian gay black woman in an Irish court or in a Spanish court or a Norwegian court? Do you think he's going to care? Do you think the State Department's going to waste its funds on people they don't like now? Because that's what it's really about.
Yeah. But do you think those very same courts, take the ICC, for example, right? So out of 54 people indicted, 47 have been African.
Yep.
We know that the ICC sometimes gets called the white man's court,
or
right?
the court for only where black people and Russians get.
Right. So the question is, what makes you believe that there is any trust that we can place as an international community in these institutions any longer? Are they not also part of the disintegrating charade where we invest all this energy into these institutions, which time and time again show us that they are actually tools of imperial power, not actually in service to the purported claims of the institution?
It's a really good question, because the reality is we shouldn't trust any of the courts. I mean, the thing is that the reason we've gone for domestic courts and not international courts is people have to follow their own domestic laws to some degree, right? And the reason we've gone for countries that have been outspoken about Palestine is, again, we won't know till the action is filed. But the reason we're doing this is because these countries have already said they want to hold war criminals accountable. They think people who have been responsible for this should be held accountable. Now, while I don't trust the politicians in those countries, a lot of justices will follow the law to the letter of the law. Even the ICC made their ruling, right?
Yeah.
They can't enforce it because they're relying on European governments to make the arrest. Now, if you are in Spain or Norway or wherever, some of these countries that we're talking to, you need a local police officer to make that arrest. You don't need the government necessarily. Universal jurisdiction means you could put hands on and make a citizen's arrest, frankly. So a Brett McGurk or Blinken, and if there is an arrest warrant or a summons, you could make a citizen's arrest.
So you could go and make a citizen's arrest.
Yes. You have to notify the police.
You notify the police. You take him, accompany him clearly willingly, to a police station. And what would then happen?
He'd have to honor that summons. So whenever that is, he'd have to go there. Or if he has any intent to leave the country before that, again, we wouldn't know until that moment. But in some countries, the police force would actively respond to the summons itself. Like I can imagine a country like Norway, because they do believe in the letter of the law. They've been pretty stern on this, following their laws. So if there's a case filed there, you would have the police force of Joe Biden or any of those colleagues landed there. They would be arrested to go to court. They'd be escorted to court. It could be a summons at this point. But the really important part about that is it shrinks the world. It makes them pariahs. It makes life's hell. And also, while I don't believe EU laws will be honored here, there is the hope. There is the hope, even though, as you've pointed out, Netanyahu is still allowed to fly through Europe without anything, that because we're part of the EU and this is going to be filed in 6 European nations, there is the hope that Europol would have to act. Now, we know that Netanyahu's proved that that's not going to happen. But some member nations might start to go, okay, we will act. Remember, Europe isn't a monolith either, right? While France, Britain, and Germany have been great supporters of Israel, other countries have been even Giorgia Meloni hasn't been Israel's greatest friend here. In fact, she threw all the Israeli embassy out, right? So while I don't think she's another fascist, but she has self-interests too. Every leader does. And she has a population that is very pro-Palestinian. And she's a populist leader who might want to win again. And there are lots of things at play here that America can't control through an international institution like the ICC or the ICJ. They're playing to people's domestic populations and their courts. Who, if you look at the populations of Spain, Portugal, Norway, a handful of other European countries, they would want justice for what we see. And their court would maybe follow the law. Now, the arrest itself would the police force make it or not? That is another question.
Yeah.
But do they want to risk it? That's also the other question. Does Jake Sullivan want to risk it?
Yes.
Does he want to come to Europe and understand that he might be arrested? Because he's not Donald Trump and he's not Joe Biden.
Right.
The president might have protection. But the backroom staff, who are all orchestrators of this genocide, don't have that protection.
Yes. And so
Trump might be forced to protect Biden because of some presidential purview stuff.
Right.
But he's already made it clear he ain't protecting anybody else in that administration. And they're not executives of the White House.
Yeah.
So they're just normal citizens at this point, and their life should be made hell.
Yes.
Every IOF soldier's life should be made hell. They should not be allowed out of their imaginary state in Israel and the United States without being dragged in front of a courtroom.
And so that's what you're working towards within this framework, which is to make sure that anyone who's been participating in supporting this genocide faces some kind of pressure or attempt at accountability. You've also got another major legal effort underway, don't you, targeting Airbnb?
Well, there is another effort that is about effectively creating an environment for full BDS.
Okay.
Right. So
BDS, for those who aren't familiar.
Yeah, BDS, effective boycott, divest sanctions, which has been going on for a long time, where people have been calling to follow the South African model of isolating Israel by boycotting them, by divesting from any financial institutions, divesting from any investment in Israel, and sanctioning them. And countries are reliant on the last part, and countries have failed on that part for sure. But the public have done a fantastic job on boycotts and some form of divestment. But the reason this case is so important, and this is the work of some fantastic lawyers that I'm helping support actually. The reason this is important is because there was an ICJ ruling in 2024 that said, that these are occupied territories and Israel should leave. And when you do that sort of ruling, what you set up an environment for is any money made in occupied territories for the occupier is proceeds of crime. At that point, any business making money from proceeds of crime could face international sanctions, could be banned from other territories, could face other legal action that could fine them for unrecognizable amounts that they don't know today, and they're not willing to do that. And there has not been a better case for people making profit of war crimes than the travel industry, who have used literally stolen homes and advertised them on their platforms, and the money going to the Israelis. Right?
And
they
so
literally
are you able to
effectively-
name those companies? I mean, is there a legal case against them currently?
There are multiple, Airbnb one of them, Booking being another. There is cases against them and others who are, and Airbnb being one of the most famous ones. Obviously, that's the headline grabber, right? And Booking, I guess, is
a big one
pretty
too.
big
I mean, people will be preparing for their summer holidays right now.
100%.
Those will be top of the list for
Can you
many people.
Can you imagine, like, you're a Brit right now, and like someone steals your house, kicks you out, and the government supports them and says you have no rights in that house anymore, and then you see your house listed on Airbnb. And they're going to make money off a house that they didn't pay for. So that's what Airbnb is doing right now. That's what Booking's doing.
Yeah.
Anyone watching this, like, you shouldn't be using those platforms, because the reality is that they're making a chunk of their money from stolen properties.
Yeah.
And the reason, the link to full BDS is that, you could say, oh, they could pull out the West Bank or the Golan Heights or anything that's occupied, is so much of Israeli settlement money is tied into their full economy that you can't separate the two anymore. So if a business is found guilty of making money from proceeds of crime, proceeds of war crimes, what will end up happening is they would be punished for operating in the entire region, in the entire country. And if your Airbnb's board, and you get a court order to say, stop doing this, otherwise you'll face other sanctions. And you don't know what those other sanctions will be.
Yeah.
And these court cases will be heard in Europe where, by the way, these countries did sign things. And while they might not be punitive to Netanyahu, they might have to pretend to care about businesses.
Yeah.
They might say, well, you're going to be banned in France and England until you pull out of...
so you're specifically referring here to like the laws that prohibit illegal settlements, right? Which are massively expanded across the West Bank.
100%. But also like literal Palestinians' homes stolen in Palestinian towns and now being put on these platforms for people to like holiday in. It's wild that people do this in that environment. But the point being that like if you make proceeds from war crimes, you could be sanctioned from Europe. Like, can you imagine Airbnb's board or Booking's board or whatever other travel company's board going, okay, so are we going to give up Israel or are we going to give up Europe? They're not going to, there's not even a discussion here.
Well, I hope not. So, but I think with where we're at right now, it's a real question.
It is a real question. But would they pull out of, because people do care about money.
Yes.
And American board members care about money. A quote unquote quiet removal from Israel is more beneficial to people who like to make millions of dollars than being kicked out of Italy, where they could basically make a ton of revenue because of some shows and every American traveling to Italy right now. What would you pick? And most boards, I think, will take the easy answer. And they'll try and do this quietly behind the scenes. They don't want to. They won't make a stink of it. But the point is, you're putting them in the position where they have to make these decisions.
But do you have any precedents of this kind of pressure actually working on companies? Because I do think, if I'm honest, that there's a lot of people who feel a little bit disillusioned with even BDS. You know, does it work? Does boycotting Starbucks and McDonald's work? Like, does it change anything if we stop using Airbnb or Booking.com? Like, is it actually going to shift anything? And on top of that, we're obviously seeing a wider climate that I can see these policies that have been brought in, these particularly in the US, but here as well, are designed to spread fear, right, among people who speak up on Palestine or who act up on Palestine. And teach everyone a lesson through that. So I think there's like a combination of like disillusionment and fear, which is not a great combination for action. So how would you respond to people who just say, look, the crackdown is immense, you know, I can't be losing my job, my freedom, whatever it may be. None of this is actually working. You know, what evidence do you have that if we do this, it's going to bring about any of the change?
Well, the historical case of South Africa. Coca-Cola, loads of big brands, they were eventually pulled out and it crippled South Africa. And that's one of the most important tools we can use. Remember, the West's most important tool isn't military force, it's economic sanctions. That's how they cripple countries into civil wars, disruption, where they need to come in and save everybody in the end. That's what works for us too. We need to cripple, as a black activist in 2020 reminded me, when you fuck with white man's money, everything changes. Right? So, and that is literally what we need to do in this case. Those bills are not enforceable. Like, the stuff in the US is already proven that how can you stop someone boycotting something? You don't even know if they're boycotting. You have to make, you know, you could boycott everything Israeli. They wouldn't know.
Yeah.
Like, you could divest your whole portfolio from Israelis. They don't know.
Yes.
Like you literally, it's fear. It's about fear, right? So on terms of the bills about BDS, there is literally nothing stopping you BDSing. And that is important because, there is 7 billion of us and maybe more than that who don't support this genocide or any genocide, period. So if we started to boycott and divest from Israel, they would be pretty crippled by now. I think everybody needs to wake up to the fact that one person saying I can't do anything is the reason we're here, because that's 7 billion of us. But the thing about what we're willing to do, if we tolerate this, everybody's next. And I don't think people truly understand that. You think what's happening in America is not going to happen around Europe? Germany's already rolling out their deportation policy. Do you think the UK is going to, while the UK is distracted about whether it's going to have an economy, once they figure out their stuff, do you not think they're going to do that here? They already stripped citizenship based on some bullshit, effectively. They should, if they believed she was a terrorist, they should have tried her in the UK and locked her up in the UK, if they really believed it. They couldn't prove that. So they just how many other people do you think they're going to do that to, potentially? Because if it becomes normal somewhere, if these genocides, these actions, these violent acts from America become normal, what's to stop all Western leaders doing that to their populations as well as anyone who speaks out on any issue? So if you care about homelessness and you're causing too much trouble one day. The environment. They're going to put you not just in jail, they might deport you. They might make you stateless. They might do. They're doing all these things, and they all support each other's decisions behind the scenes on this. There is nothing about this that the UK doesn't seem okay with the stripping of citizenship. We've already done it. So when people ask, what can I do? This is the moment to do it.
Yes.
Because this is our last chance to do it. The protests are great. These 800,000 person marches are fantastic. We need to show solidarity to Palestinians so they know we still give a damn. But in your day-to-day life, at this point, this is the time to break this country. This is the time to... This country's never been weaker, by the way. If we're just talking about the UK, for example. We have never been weaker. We isolate from Europe, economically isolate from the United States now. There's no good deal just because you got 10% tariffs. Some industries are being hit by 20 behind the scenes, like the car industry. It's done. It's finished. Our politicians are holding on to, while big majorities, slim majorities. Right? This is the time to cripple the UK, if you are watching from the UK, to actually end its support from Israel. If, let's say, the full 1 million people who turned up to a march suddenly said tomorrow, we're not all paying taxes. The UK is bankrupt. The UK is bankrupt. You could cripple the country overnight. And are we at that point where we're going to, Starmer and co are not going to arrest all 1 million? Let's just be clear. They're not going to arrest all 1 million if everyone did in solidarity. But also, are we at the point where they're going to risk the economic collapse of this country for a few weapons licenses?
Here's the question, Ashish. We both know it wouldn't be 4 million people doing it. And they would make an example, just like they did with Mahmoud Khalil, of 1 or 2 people to scare everyone else into submission.
100%. And what did that do in the US? It mobilized more people. So what I ask British people watching is, there's nothing stopping you. People are, in the US, with less protection from the police, with less, while we have freedom of speech enshrined, it's disappearing.
It is.
While we have constitutional rights, they're disappearing, and yet people are fighting. Right? Where is your fight? Except Pal Action, I see, where is your fight? I still see too many people in our circle who condemn resistance. I still see too many people in our circle who are deliberating what a just settlement looks like for both sides. Are we still here? Are we still in this conversation? Are we still having that? 2 years into a Holocaust at this point? Not a genocide, a Holocaust. They're burning people alive. It's a Holocaust. And people are still deliberating whether it's too risky to speak or do anything. I go back to, if you tolerate this, it will happen to our children. My son, an Israeli tried to burn my son in the streets of the United States of America. That will happen here. We've had race riots recently, haven't they, in the UK? This stuff is percolating, and they're being condoned. They're being not condemned, condoned by our leaderships. They want that oppressive nature and that fear to be in communities that are impacted. They want that to be in people who care for other people. Because they want a semblance of control. And this is the moment for everyone to act. If you care about the future of humanity, this is where I go with this. This is our collective human future. And Nora Erekat could not have spoken about Palestinians are the canary. This is where it starts. They test weapons on Palestinians that they start to use everywhere else. They test policy on Palestinians they start to apply to everywhere else. That is going to happen to all of us. and people like who sit at home and think, hey, I'm putting my head in the sand and nothing's going to happen and nothing's going to impact my life. I haven't worked for 2 years on anything but Gaza. We gave up everything to do this. And yes, because I have access to diplomats and because I have access to things, it made sense to do that work.
Yeah.
But we've risked everything ourselves to do that. Because there is no more important issue in our time than giving up everything we can to help people in the most oppressed part of the world right now.
And you managed to remain hopeful through these 2 years of working solely on this. I mean, where are you finding the hope for the fight today? Because I have to be honest, obviously, with the end of the so-called ceasefire, which obviously now is
they
clearly
never ceased fire, as you know,
revealed to be the hostage exchange deal, which I said it was months ago, and nobody wanted to hear it for obvious reasons. People wanted to have some hope that things were going to get better, but anyway, we know that hostage deal, temporary truce, is now gone. The Strip is under merciless assault. No aid has gone in for the last month at all. No food, no medication, no clean water. I've heard they've started pumping seawater into the pipes of homes in Gaza now. Where are you finding the hope, Ashish? Like, where is the sense that, if we just fight on, things are going to change, things are going to get better? Because I think a lot of people feel like maybe it can only get worse.
I find hope in Palestinians because what they're going through is nothing. We are going through nothing compared to them. And they have managed to survive this long in this genocide, this long. And they're still fighting for hope. They're growing again in some parts. They're even under all the siege. The innovation is something to aspire to. Their ability to take care of the community is outstanding. Even in this environment, my hope is that's the best of humanity. That is truly the best of humanity. And we should offer everything we can to save that, because that's the humanity we should be building. Right? That's the humanity that we all should have for each other. That is the love and decency we should also have for each other, but also like the revolutionary mindset we should have for each other. There is another way, right? Is there though? This way that we live in now is not healing, is it? We have massive homelessness, people who are massively in debt. Medical debt in the United States is one of the biggest killers. In the UK, can you get an ambulance? I don't know. Like, is the way we're doing
difficulty.
This? Is what we're doing now working?
Yeah.
Right? Is what we're doing with all our resources and all the resources we steal from the rest of the world true? Is it working? And that's not happening. That's literally, we are still poor. The UK outside of London is one of the poorest countries in the world.
Yeah.
It's kind of insane when you think
insane.
about it. And we have all this resources and all this wealth building up in the EU. This is not working. Palestinians show us a way the world could be, and we should aspire to that.
So last hopeful message for people who are watching this and thinking, I protested for months, it's not working. I get these messages all the time, by the way, on social media. I've protested, I've written to my MP, I've done it all. It's not working. What can we do more? What would you answer?
I think follow the tactics of organizations in the United States, like within our lifetime. We have to disrupt. We have to break any possible way for our countries to support. Look, I believe, and a lot of UN people believe this too, who actually are experts on this issue, including people who've negotiated this thing. Freedom for Palestinians will happen, and that region will be done by the resistance in those regions, whether it be southern Lebanon or we are not picking up guns and fighting. That they will get their freedom. The fact that Israel has resorted to such violent airstrikes shows that they can't win an actual fight with Palestinians or the Lebanese or anyone in that region. Our job is to cripple our support of the Israeli institutions. That is by your choices, whether you boycott, divest, sanction stuff, right? But also by disrupting our economies to the point where they cannot afford to support this. And it's just not as simple as I'm not going to buy stuff or I'm going to stand in the road. This is making sure people who've supported this lives are hell. Keir Starmer's life should be hell to live. Mm-hmm. How is that not in and of itself something that everyone who sees him on the street is calling him out for? He should not be welcome anywhere, not at an Arsenal game, nowhere. People should make it clear it's peaceful, but hey, you should be calling him out on this and make his impossible life to live. But also, this is the most important thing you can do right now. there are support organizations that are actually going to put their bodies on the line, right, globally, that are doing this, whether it be Pal Action, whether it be in this country, I think Youth Demand, right?
Yeah, Youth Demand
whether
also,
they support them. They're going to go to court, support them. Show the courts that you care about them because they're doing everything they can to stop the most horrific crime of our lifetime, right? Because that support goes a long way. And finally, I think one of the biggest things people can do right now is, stop relying on politicians to save us. There's no great savior coming from the political class. They're bought into this.
Yeah.
We need to make it clear that we know that, we're aware of that, and we're going to make sure that every institution and every executive who supports this, whether it be FIFA, football, and everything else, that they know that they cannot continue to operate in a normal way. Constituency meetings, FIFA board meetings, whatever, company meetings that support Israel, right?
Yeah.
They cannot operate in a normal way going forward, and we will cripple any of that going forward.
Ashish Prashar, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. We hope this conversation gave you something to sit with, question, and carry forward. Here at The Tea, we are all about spotlighting voices and stories that don't always get the mic. If that matters to you too, you can support us by subscribing, share this episode, or join us on Patreon. Until next time, stay awake, stay curious, and keep the conversation going in the comments below.